Well, first of all, many thanks for the invitation and good meeting all of you, including out there. Yes, there is a EU policy. There is a stated policy. Somewhat is all anchored in a very lengthy document called the European Council Conclusions from 2018. And without simplifying it unnecessarily, it is basically, it can be summarized to the three no's, and that is no to normalization, no to lifting sanctions, no to reconstruction support before a political process in line with 2254 is firmly underway. And if we just unpack that a bit, the premise for that policy was and remains as a stated policy, and only through a combination of carrots and sticks would there be any prospect for the regime to engage in good faith in any political process. I'll be the first one to say, sadly, that we have seen absolutely no effect of that policy in that neither the carrots nor the sticks have been working. And I think it sounds a bit cynical, but I think we also have to be honest that there's never been any political process, genuine process when it comes to, let's say, pursuit of a political solution vis-a-vis Syria. Yes, meetings have been taking place, quite a few, I should add, but there's not really been any process. Why? Because the regime, and obviously the backers of the regime, have not been anywhere near a point where they felt it was in their interest to engage in that process in good faith. Over time, sadly, we have seen that certain, let me say, EU policymakers have somewhat, instead of actually staying loyal to the very simple conflict and political analysis, they appear to getting more itchy fingers in that they are more focusing on, they're less focused on the sticks and more focused on the carrots, even though from a simple analytical perspective, I think all of us would quickly agree that they would not work. I can only say, and kind of summarize in a very simple way, that as we're all aware, there have been a number of different normalization efforts. We have seen the readmission of Syria into the Arab League. And I think if we summarize what drove that, it was somewhat a wish from certain Gulf countries that to serve their interest of security and pushing back on the Captagon and also vis-a-vis the whole refugee piece, they assessed that this was the way to go to have some deliveries on those three files. And with a bit of a smiley, yes, there has been one delivery from Damascus, that is more Captagon. So I think that is exactly the opposite effect that we've been seeing. And it just confirms that, also as my colleagues have been saying, that we have not seen any sign, we're not seeing any signs of any genuine goodwill from the regime to engage in that political solution. If anything, they have actually moved even further away from the goal. It is as if they were in front of the goal previously. At times they're moving behind the goal. So I think against all of that and driven by a number of the other political considerations in Europe, not least domestic political considerations, where the core European interest also being in a more, let's say, close geographical proximity to Syria than, for instance, the US, is that let's say the interests vis-a-vis migration, refugees, security concerns and considerations have somewhat led certain policymakers to make the fundamental mistake to actually try to look at the symptoms instead of the root causes. And their policy, their approach is increasingly guided by providing some symptom relief, a bit of paracetamol, whether it's 250 grams or 500 milligrams, we can debate, but we all know that a paracetamol expires after a certain time. The relief lapses after a certain time, and actually only until and unless you address the root causes of the conflict. And we can summarize them to corruption, oppression, marginalization, impunity. The list is long. Until and unless we are honest about the root causes, I'm very concerned that we will not get anywhere near For sure not a good solution, if any solution at all. And that is, I think, from a European, let's say, and I should say, I guess, you know, I used to be a diplomat, so now I'm anything but diplomatic, so I'm just an ordinary citizen. I think that's most frustrating as an ordinary European citizen is that policies seems to be shying away from what is needed, from the right thing to do in terms of supporting the changes we all think Syrians both need and deserve, but also that actually it is mind-blowing that the policies sometimes are actually not serving European interests. For me, those two are not incompatible. It is only until and unless you address the root causes that actually Europe will also have been able to address their own core interests of migration and refugees. You can't disconnect the two. But increasingly, policy responses are yet again driven, guided by symptoms instead of the root causes. If I may just add one bit, and that is, for me, the key issue, the one we really have to follow closely, is the one of normalization. And normalization can take many forms and shapes. There's obviously the full-blown, where a country goes back to Damascus, reopens his embassy, an ambassador hands over his or her credentials to the regime. But normalization can also take many other shapes and forms. And that's what we see from certain European quarters now. Just to mention a few, obviously there's more diplomatic engagement. Concretely, there are more European visits to Damascus now than before. Two, we have also seen it, and for instance, when it comes to the refugee file, you may be aware that was it last week or 10 days ago, there was a letter signed by 8 European countries. I'm sad to say that Denmark was one of the signatories, was actually saying the need to reassess the conditions for refugees to return to Syria. But if you read that statement carefully, towards the end, it somewhat says that while it is acknowledged that there's not complete political stability yet, blah, 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 the notion that those countries' assessment is that there's some political stability is, for me, mind-blowing. There's no political stability in Syria, but obviously you're trying to drum up your case in pursuit of other objectives. So yet again, increasingly, you move your eyes away from the ball. Sadly enough, you focus more on this more tactical bits, which serves more short-term political interests.
Let me pick up on that and related to the issue of the safe environment. Like we said in the beginning, safe environment now is becoming a new buzzword. We had a few over the years, but unfortunately not in the sense that we have discussed before as being the heart of the possible prelude to a political solution, but actually being seen as in a partial ad hoc ways, like economic safe environment or this safe environment, that safe environment. What are possible long-term consequences of that approach that you basically described, trying to deal with symptoms rather than the root causes? And as you said, unfortunately, your own country, Denmark, has a history of that kind of declaring certain areas safe so that refugees, Syrian refugees in Denmark were withdrawn the protection, then having to renege on that and so on. There seems to be like touching and probing where can we achieve not a real change, but actually narrative change vis-a-vis Syria.
I think first on, I think you referred to it as a bit of a buzzword these days, SCNE, safe, calm, and neutral environment. I think when dealing with that term, that concept, I think we just have to go down memory lane a tiny bit and recall its origin, because it came about in the Geneva Communique back in the days, as well as in 2254. And its origin was very simple. There was a premise, even though obviously international actors at that time nor now agree, but there was somewhat a premise that safe, calm, and neutral environment can only be brought about if there's a new arrangement in Syria. It is not something that we can expect the current regime, the current arrangement to bring about. So that's very, very important to have in mind. So that's why I almost, from that perspective, insist that when we talk about SCNE, we confine it to track 1 and 2254 and political solution, and not go down to track 2 or track 3 or any other context. So that's very important. Then coming back to your question more squarely, I think, for instance, safe environment, for instance, also what others are somewhat putting on the table about generating some economic wheels to spin, to have some economic growth and also a bit more of a confidence building among communities. I'm definitely not against that. But yet again, I would insist that whatever at least the international community supports is supported in such a way that those measures, those efforts, those achievements do not become ends in themselves, but rather means towards something else, because none of that is an end state. It's not an end state for Syrians to have a confined safety environment in a certain geographical area. The end state is yet again a new arrangement, a new Syria, basically. So we have to be very cautious that whatever is supported do not become ends in themselves. And if I may add on that to also exemplify, that's also one of the reasons why I am concerned about this whole, another new concept, or not a new concept, but the talk in town, not least here in Brussels, around the Brussels conference environment, is the one of early recovery. And while I'll be the first to say I'm the strongest advocate for any support to Syrians in need, full stop. So that's the what bit, support, support, support. But it is as important, the what bit, early recovery, humanitarian, stabilization, as important how you support it. Because if you support it in the wrong way, you actually may end up doing more damage than good. And you may actually jeopardize what we, even though we don't agree on the end state, but you jeopardize even the way towards an end state.
Very briefly, last question to you, Ivan. How do you think things will pan out with the outcome of the European elections vis-a-vis Syria policy?
Well, I think if history has shown anything, it's very difficult to predict outcome of elections before we have somewhat done all the counting and the numbers. But if the some of the analysis is anything to go by, there will be, let's say, generally a shift to the right in the makeup of the European Parliament. And I think if that is to happen, I think it is equally fair to say that then there will be even stronger push from the European Parliament side to have more tighter, more stricter regulation on not only migration, but also refugees. And that obviously, sadly enough, may come with some additional challenges and risks for Syrians in Europe.